It started as a dare, like most reckless plans in our group. My friends and I had known each other since high school, a tight-knit group of 5 who'd been through breakups, road trips, and all-nighters together. We were all a few years out of college, caught between growing up and hanging on to that carefree sense of adventure. Alex was the ringleader, always quick to find something cool or thrilling to do. And this time he discovered an old government research facility, nestled deep in the woods on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years. It was just the sort of thing to draw us in, especially with the rumors surrounding it. Strange lights spotted in the forest at night, people wandering too close and disappearing without a trace, local legends of twisted experiments from the Cold War era. Most of it was probably nothing more than urban legend, but there were enough stories to give the place an eerie mystique, one we couldn't resist exploring. We decided we'd go in for just an hour, take some videos, maybe try to capture evidence of ghosts for laughs, and get out before midnight. The night we went, we piled into my old truck, loaded with flashlights, cameras, and a few drinks to take the edge off. There was something comforting about hearing everyone's familiar banter as we drove through winding roads into the forest, the headlights casting eerie, shifting shadows against the trees. I remember feeling a strange thrill as we finally arrived, parking near a rusted gate covered in faded government warnings. The facility loomed up in front of us, a squat, 3-story building with broken windows, the kind of place that felt like it had been forgotten, left to rot, almost as if it was hiding itself from the world. It was unnaturally quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. As we approached the entrance, I felt an odd sense of reluctance, something I couldn't quite place, like the feeling you get when you forget something important but can't remember what it is. But we laughed it off, with Alex joking about us being urban explorers, and I followed the others inside. Once we entered, the air felt different, stale and thick, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. We wandered through dimly lit corridors lined with peeling paint, our flashlights casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to slither across the walls. Most rooms were empty, stripped of anything valuable, though occasionally we'd pass remnants of old machinery, strange rusted equipment bolted to the floor, and desks littered with unrecognizable pieces of paper, their ink faded to ghostly smears. I was half expecting to stumble across old lab animals in cages, but thankfully, the place was silent, empty except for us. As we walked, Alex kept pushing us to go deeper, joking that the good stuff was probably hidden in the basement. Part of me wanted to protest, to turn back while we still could, but I kept quiet, not wanting to be the one to chicken out. About 30 minutes in, something strange happened. We'd split into pairs to cover more ground. Alex with Aaron, Ben with Sarah, leaving me alone. I didn't mind. I was used to exploring places on my own, and I liked the quiet. But as I moved through a narrow hallway on the 2nd floor, I heard what sounded like soft footsteps behind me. Not echoing, but almost muted, as if someone was moving in sync with me. I spun around, shining my flashlight back down the empty hallway, but there was no one there, just silence, and the faint hum of distant electricity, as if the facility were still partially alive. Brushing it off as my nerves, I continued, but the sound returned, following me at intervals, always out of sight but close enough to set my teeth on edge. I eventually found my way into a large room that looked like an observation chamber, with a long glass wall separating it from the next room. Behind the glass were rows of empty chairs facing a stage, almost like a small auditorium. What caught my attention, though, was a single object resting on the floor near the glass. A small black notebook, untouched by the dust that coated everything else. Picking it up, I flipped through the pages, which were filled with notes in a scrawled, barely legible handwriting. The notes described a series of tests involving human volunteers, references to cognitive manipulation, and behavioral triggers. Each entry grew stranger, with the writer detailing subjects experiencing hallucinations, paranoia, and vivid, personalized visions of their deepest fears. One note caught my eye. The entity adapts. Each subject sees a different version, crafted from their own mind. Isolation only intensifies the effects. The words felt heavy, and a chill ran down my spine as I realized that the author might have been describing exactly what was beginning to happen to us. I tried to call the others on our walkie-talkies, but all I got was static. Deciding to find Alex, I retraced my steps, but the layout of the facility seemed different somehow, as if corridors had shifted or I'd taken a wrong turn. Doors that had once been open were now closed, and some hallways felt longer, stretching into darkness with no end in sight. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie, jerking shadows as I made my way down what felt like an endless corridor. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I started to feel a gnawing sense of panic that I couldn't shake. Then I heard it again, the soft footsteps behind me, this time accompanied by a faint, almost melodic whispering, like someone calling my name in a tone just low enough to make me doubt my own senses. After what felt like an eternity, I found Alex, sitting alone in a room filled with shattered glass and overturned chairs. He looked up at me, his face pale, eyes wide with an unsettling blankness. When I asked him if he was okay, he just nodded, his mouth moving as if he were talking, but no sound came out. I grabbed his arm, trying to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, and he snapped out of it, looking at me as if he'd just woken from a nightmare. "I saw something," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Something that knew me, knew my fears. It was like it was showing me things, making me see what it wanted." His words hit too close to what I'd read in the notebook, and a creeping dread settled over me as I realized we might be dealing with something beyond our understanding. We managed to find the others, each of them looking equally shaken, their faces drawn and tense. Sarah swore she'd seen shadows following her, mimicking her movements but with a delayed reaction, while Ben claimed he'd heard a voice taunting him, whispering secrets he'd never told anyone, secrets that were buried so deep even he had trouble recalling them. We decided to stick together and head back to the entrance, but as we retraced our steps, it became clear that the building wasn't letting us leave so easily. Every hallway we took led us back to the same few rooms, looping us in a twisted maze that seemed to change every time we turned around. The air grew heavier, thick with a smell I hadn't noticed before, an acrid metallic odor like old blood and burnt wires. The longer we wandered, the more I felt something pressing against my thoughts, an invasive presence that seemed to know exactly how to needle at my mind, dredging up memories I'd long since buried, moments of guilt and regret that I'd tried to forget. I started seeing flashes of familiar faces, people I'd wronged or lost, their expressions twisted in anger, accusing me, mocking me. The others began acting strangely, too. Sarah clung to Ben, her eyes darting to empty corners, and Alex kept muttering under his breath, glancing over his shoulder as if he were expecting something to appear. We were falling apart, our group dynamic crumbling as paranoia set in, each of us beginning to suspect the other of something unseen. At some point, we stumbled into a room that was different from the rest. Cold, sterile, with walls lined in mirrors that reflected us in ways that didn't feel quite right. The reflections seemed to move independently, like they were delayed, And as I looked closer, I noticed something chilling. Our reflections were watching us, not mimicking, but observing, eyes flicking to each of us in turn, their faces distorted with an intensity that felt almost alive. When I moved closer to the mirror, I saw something behind me. A dark, looming figure, its face obscured, but its presence radiating a cold, malevolent energy. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just my friends looking as terrified as I felt. We didn't speak. We just bolted from the room, each of us knowing, somehow, that we'd seen the same thing. As we stumbled through the hallways, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence, I began to feel that we were being led somewhere, drawn deeper into the facility by a force we couldn't resist. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, until we reached a door marked with a faded symbol, one that I recognized from the notebook, a spiral, twisted and endless. We hesitated, but the pressure on our minds was relentless, urging us forward. Inside, the room was empty except for a single chair facing a wall of screens, each one flickering to life as we entered, displaying footage of past visitors. Groups just like ours, all caught in the same twisted game. The screens showed people losing themselves, succumbing to the entity's manipulations, each face distorted in terror as they realized the truth. There was no way out, only the endless maze of the facility, feeding off their fear. The final screen showed us, standing in the room, our faces pale and horrified, the image lagging by a few seconds, as if it were predicting what would happen next. And then, slowly, the screen flickered to show the final screen flickered, and then a new image replaced our reflections, an aerial view of the facility itself, as if captured by a drone hovering over the building. It showed the facility in real time, with shadows stretching out from the trees around it, creating a dark web that seemed to reach toward the walls, almost merging with the structure itself. What made it horrifying was how those shadows pulsed, breathing like living things. As we watched, transfixed, the image zoomed in, showing the building's exits, doors, windows, every potential escape, each one covered in an unnatural darkness, a crawling, inky blackness that felt alive. Every exit was blocked, but not in a physical way. Instead, it seemed like we were watching through a lens distorted by whatever was in the facility. Our eyes were seeing the doors as impenetrable, every path out sealed by a force that twisted reality. We couldn't be sure anymore if any exit was truly blocked or if we were just being forced to believe it. Alex moved first, shaking his head, muttering, "It's just trying to scare us. It's fake. They're just screens." He turned and started walking toward the hallway, and the rest of us followed, desperation pushing us forward. We reached the main corridor, but each time we tried to turn toward the exit, the hallways seemed to lead us in circles, as though the very geometry of the building were shifting around us. It felt like walking through a maze designed by someone who knew our minds intimately, twisting reality to manipulate our thoughts and perceptions. Whenever we got close to an exit, we'd catch a glimpse of it, just out of reach, but the hallways would stretch, narrow, and our steps would slow as if we were wading through thick air, until the exit vanished, replaced by another endless corridor. At one point, I felt sure I'd seen the door leading outside, its frame outlined by moonlight, but as I reached for it, my hand passed through only darkness, and I found myself stumbling backward into another room, the others trailing behind in silent horror. The hallucinations began to change after that, intensifying, growing more personal. The facility wasn't just blocking our escape, it was probing our minds, pulling out the memories and fears we'd buried, manipulating our perceptions until it felt like reality was warping around us. Sarah started screaming, clutching her head, shouting about a figure she kept seeing. Her little brother, who died years ago in a car accident, standing at the end of every hallway, reaching out for her with hollow eyes. No one else saw him, but the terror in her face was real. Her voice choked with grief and fear as she insisted that he was calling her, begging her to come closer. Ben started muttering to himself, glancing over his shoulder, saying he could hear voices accusing him, voices he couldn't escape. He'd always kept his past private, but now, under the facility's influence, he confessed he'd once been involved in something he regretted, an accident he'd kept hidden, and now the victim's voice was calling out to him, saying things only he would know. I tried to keep my own thoughts focused, to separate what was real from the illusions, but even I began seeing flashes, faces of people from my past, mistakes I'd made, fears I couldn't shake. The hallucinations weren't random. They were perfectly tailored to each of us, pulling apart our minds until we were each lost in our private horrors, unable to trust anything we saw or heard. We tried to stay together, but the longer we wandered, the more disoriented we became, each of us stumbling through the corridors like sleepwalkers, drawn toward different visions, each vision pulling us in different directions. At one point, I reached out for Alex, only for my hand to pass right through him, as if he were nothing but a shadow, a phantom. I blinked, and he was gone, replaced by an empty corridor, my friends nowhere in sight. Alone, I wandered deeper into the building, my mind unraveling as the facility twisted my perceptions until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I stumbled into a room filled with old hospital beds, each one occupied by figures strapped down, faces contorted in silent screams. The sight was horrifying, but as I moved closer, I realized that the faces were familiar. They were my friends. Each of them was strapped to a bed, their eyes open but unseeing, their mouths moving in silent agony. I tried to wake them, but as I reached out, my hand passed through them, and I understood with a sickening clarity that these were hallucinations, figments of my own mind created by the entity, meant to trap me in a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then came the worst part. The facility seemed to shift again, and I found myself back at the entrance, staring at the open door, the one that led outside. For a brief moment, I thought I'd finally broken free, that I'd found the way out, but something felt wrong. The air was too still, too silent, and I realized with a cold, sinking dread that the door wasn't real. It was another illusion, one crafted so perfectly that I almost believed it. But as I reached out to touch it, the walls around me pulsed, as if mocking my attempt to escape, and the door faded, leaving me alone in the darkness once again. I stood there in the dark, trying to pull myself together, gripping the wall, taking deep breaths, anything to ground myself. The door had been so real. I'd felt the draft of air, the scent of damp earth and freedom just beyond it. But it was gone now, leaving only the stale, suffocating air of the facility. I was alone, my friends gone, and I couldn't be sure if they were even real anymore. I started moving, slowly, careful to avoid any doors, looking only at the floor, focusing on each step, trying to ignore the shadows that twisted and pulsed around me. Every once in a while, I'd hear a faint voice, like someone calling from down the hall, but I didn't dare turn toward it. I knew by now that it was the facility's way of drawing me deeper, of manipulating my mind to keep me wandering. As I stumbled forward, I saw a glint of metal in the corner of my eye, a small, plain door I hadn't seen before. Unlike the others, it wasn't shrouded in darkness, nor did it twist away when I approached. It was just there, waiting, almost unremarkable. I hesitated, reaching out to touch it, half expecting my hand to pass through like before, but the door felt solid under my fingers. I pushed, and it swung open, revealing a stairwell leading down. It was narrow, unlit, and seemed to descend forever, vanishing into shadows that felt heavier than the darkness in the halls. For a moment, I considered going back, retracing my steps, but something about this door felt different. Felt final, like the last choice I'd have in this place. I took the first step, the sound of my shoes echoing in the silence, each step heavier than the last. I could feel the walls pressing in, the darkness growing thicker, almost tangible, but I kept going, one foot after another, descending deeper, hoping that this was finally the way out. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the dim light, my body growing numb as I descended. At the bottom, there was another door, old and worn, with a small circular window. Through the glass, I saw only blackness, but I pushed it open, stepping into what felt like the heart of the facility. The room was vast and empty, but the walls were covered in screens. Dozens, maybe hundreds, each one flickering with images of the rooms, hallways, and stairwells I'd been wandering through. Some showed me alone, moving aimlessly. Others showed my friends, their faces blank, their movements mechanical, as if they were no longer in control. And then, on one of the screens, I saw myself, standing right where I was, staring back at the screen, my expression hollow. I felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, like I'd been here before, like I was watching a memory playing out, something I couldn't escape. I wanted to turn and run, but the screen changed, shifting to a new image. One of the exit, bright and clear, the door standing open under a shaft of moonlight. For the first time, I saw it without any distortion, without shadows or illusions. I could see the path out, so close, but as I turned, ready to sprint toward it, the walls of the room began to close in, the screens flickering off, one by one, leaving me in darkness. I ran toward where the exit should have been, but each step felt heavier, as if something were dragging me down, pulling me back into the facility. I reached out, desperate, feeling the cold air slip through my fingers, but the door vanished, replaced by another empty hallway, stretching out in front of me. In that final moment, I realized the truth, that there was no exit, that the facility was a trap designed to keep us here, feeding off our fear, our desperation. It wasn't the building that was haunted. It was us. We'd brought our own demons, our own fears, and the facility had turned them against us, creating a prison we couldn't escape because it was built from our own minds. As I sank to my knees, the last screen flickered on, showing my reflection one final time. My face pale, my eyes empty, staring back at me with the same hopelessness I'd seen in my friends. And then, the lights went out, leaving me in the darkness, a part of the facility, trapped in its endless halls, just another figure moving through its corridors. As time goes on, I think to myself that there is no possible way to escape. That's when I thought about it. What if I make the entity believe escaping is my biggest fear, something I would hate so I could be set free? But if I made myself believe I feared leaving this cursed place, then I wouldn't even try to leave. There almost is really no way to escape.